let me begin by thanking the organizers to have me here. I'm very pleased to be speaking here at Aliah University. Now, the previous speaker has already, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. The previous speaker, Rana, has already spoken about the Sachar committee. What I'm going to do here is to do something different, to focus on how the positive features of Sachar committee was suppressed, or how under the current government all the schemes that he had suggested was not followed. And we have to go into understanding the reasons for its near dumping by the current government. So why the Sachar is out of scene in the current political dispensation. Now I want to do this by bringing Sachar Report in conversation with The White Tiger, a novel written by Arvind Adiga. There are very few people who have done this kind of comparison. Though separated only by 2 years, there has not been much conversation between the Sachar Committee report and Arvind Adiga's novel, The White Tiger. By making this conversation, I argue about Re-Orientalism and how it works in practice. To demonstrate this argument, I discussed responses to the Sachar report from the Hindutva formations like the BJP and the RSS. And I also discussed the opposition by the Modi's Gujarat government to the implementation of the scholarship scheme as recommended by Sachar report. Having demonstrated the re-orientalist opposition to the Sachar report and its eventual dumping by the current government, in part 2 of my talk, I contend that the victory of re-orientalism, and I will define these terms shortly, the victory of re-orientalism was not inevitable because there was a path other than re-orientalism. However, the rampant notion of democracy, a democracy which is much more mediatized, ceremonial, statistical, and corporate driven, blocked this very path. And I will conclude with theoretical observation about the term Re-Orientalism. Now, as it is well known about the Sachar report, but I just want to briefly mention that it drew on both academic and non-academic literature, including the 2001 census report, national sample survey, and concluded, quote, while there is a considerable variation in the condition of Muslims across the states, the community exhibits deficits and deprivation in practically all dimensions of development. In fact, by and large, Muslims rank somewhat above SCs and STs, but far below Hindu OBCs, other minorities, and Hindus general, mostly upper caste in almost all indicators considered, end of quote. Now, without going into further details, let me mention a positive finding of the Sachar report, and as it was mentioned, the rate of infant mortality was far lower among Muslims, and unlike Hindus, Muslims were more receptive to the birth of female children. Now, the Sachar report mentioned that of the many estates where the condition of Muslim was grave, the report identified 4 estates where the condition was really dire, and Bihar is one of them. And Adiga's novel, The White Tiger, actually begins precisely in Bihar. Actually, the place is called Lakshmangarh, a village in Gaya. Those of you who might have read this novel, and as it is the case, it got a lot of literary prizes. In the novel, the main protagonist, called Balram, he is born in a Halwai non-twice born caste. And he describes how his father, who was a rickshaw puller, died due to lack of medical care. When his father, suffering from tuberculosis, was taken to the hospital, there was no doctor. At the hospital, Balram meets two people he calls Muslim men. One of them had an open wound on his leg. He invited Balram and his brother to sit beside him. This episode shows the poor condition of both Dalits and Muslims, and both denied treatment. However, as the novel progresses, so does Balram's ambition to join rising India and thereby participate in what Meeta Banerjee, Lisa Lau and Christine Mendes alludes to as Hindu Orientalism. And that exactly is the point on which the shared marginality of Dalit and Muslims begin to diverge. Having joined as I'm just going to give you a bit of the context of the novel so that it can be related to the Sachar Committee report. Having joined as driver-servant the family of the upper caste businessman, the stork, and his son Ashok, Balram knew well that his success depended on removing the existing driver, whose name was Ram Prasad, a grim-looking fellow. In Balram's own account, Prasad was a far better driver. He was honest. The family trusted him to the extent that wearing the dark glasses, Pinky Madam, who is the American Christian wife of Ashok, she preferred to play badminton with him. That she preferred to play badminton with Ram Prasad rather than Balram, it generated hatred in Balram, who wanted to dislodge Prasad because he was the favored servant. Now, what Balram does, he devises a scheme to dislodge Ram Prasad. He finds out that actually in the last week, Ram Prasad has stopped eating in the day. So he follows him one evening to discover that actually every day he went to pray in the mosque. And this is the month of Ramadan. So the new secret is that actually Ram Prasad is actually a Muslim guy who has changed his name just to become the driver in this family. And Balram uses this secret to dislodge Ram Prasad, whose actual name is Muhammad. Now, Balram, he himself acknowledges that, and I will quote here, what a miserable life Prasad had, having to hide his religion, his name, just to get a job as a driver. And he is a good driver, no question of it. A far better one than I will ever be. Part of me wanted to get up and apologize to him right there and say, you never did anything to hurt me, unquote. But Balram, in the novel, never apologizes to Muhammad. Even as both shared life and actually lived in the same servant room, Muhammad's disappearance in the midst of India rising as a future superpower is thus triple. First, like his parents, Balram's own initial life remains poor while India rose economically. Second, as India began to be visible on international stage, Muhammad's own name was made to become invisible. Third, Balram expelled Muhammad from the rest of his narrative in the novel. Though Muhammad is erased from the narrative, his religion is not. Thus, after killing his boss Ashok, and I assume some knowledge about the white tiger, but it is likely many of you may not have read it. So Balram, the driver, he actually kills his own boss called Ashok, and he kills him by ramming a bottle into his skull. And at that point, Balram observes, and I quote, "The blood was draining from the neck quite fast. I believe this is the way Muslims kill their chicken," end of quote. And in Bangalore, where Balram has become a rich businessman and his driver Asif kills a boy in the accident, Balram remarks, and I quote, "I have come to respect Muslims, sir. They are not the brightest lot, except for those four poet fellows, but they make good drivers and they are honest people by and large, although a few of them seem to get this urge to blow trains up every year. I was not going to fire Asif over this," unquote. This quote is striking for various reasons. First, the blowing up of the train is a direct reference to the so-called Islamic terrorism integral to Indian and international politics. Balram takes it as a fact that it is Muslims who blow this train up. It is well known that activists of the RSS and other Hindutva affiliates, they have enacted many terrorist blasts like the Ajmer Dargah case. Yet, the novel attributes terrorism to Muslims who have this urge. And the urge is not temporary, it is perpetual, every year. Moreover, Balram's reference to respecting Muslims is equally striking, for there is no mention of respecting Hindus or even identifying his character as explicitly Hindus. However, Muslims are described explicitly as Muslims. So when he walks through the book bazaar in Delhi, he calls the bookseller the Muslim uncle. It is this Muslim uncle who tells Balram about Rumi, Iqbal, Ghalib. Balram calls them Muslim poets. Sanjay Subramaniam, who wrote about this novel, describes this part of the White Tiger as sheer falsity. Beyond falsity, I suggest Adiga enacts what Lisa Lau, Anna Miendis, following Meeta Banerjee, alludes to as Hindu Orientalism. Hindu Orientalism is a set of practices and strategies rooted in what Lau calls Re-Orientalism. The role of Old Orientalism, that is, the relationship of the dominance and representation of Orientals by the non-Oriental or the Occidental, now is taken over by the other Orientals. And this process of Orientalism by Orientals is Re-Orientalism. In Bollywood, Banerjee describes working of Hindu Orientalism as follows. It re-orientalizes India for the Western audience, and it re-orientalizes Hindu India for the benefit of Hindu mainstream audience in India, marginalizing Muslims in the process. An Orientalist gaze on the Orient and a Hindu gaze on India's Muslim communities thus may converge. In electoral politics, which Adiga writes about, Re-Orientalism takes on new dimension. In politics, Hindu majority orientalizes Muslims for the enjoyment of its assumed Hindu core, as well as for the Western desire. And unlike old Orientalists who mastered languages and religions of the Orientals, Re-Orientalism through Hindu Orientalism requires no such mastery. Balram thus can write about Rumi, Ghalib, and Iqbal without knowing the languages of these poets. In 18th and 19th century Orientalism, Muslims were surely the other, but only a few Muslims lived in the society European Orientalists came from. In Hindu Orientalism, Muslims become the other in spite of cohabiting and sharing their space. Anthropologist Johannes Fabian calls it denial of coevalence. This Re-Orientalism is a faithful borrowing from British Orientalism. Bruce is gone, but it might have been good for him to listen to this as well. This Re-Orientalism is a faithful borrowing from British Orientalism, and a classic example is, of course, W. Hunter's The Indian Musalmans. Are they bound in conscience to rebel against the Queen? This is a text published in 1871. Adiga reproduces this foreignification of Muslims in the novel as follows. Quote, "For this land, India has never been free. First the Muslims, then the British bossed us around." Adiga doesn't stop here. He tells the Chinese premier, As many of you know, the novel is addressed as a long letter to the Chinese premier. So he writes, "By the way, Mr. Premier, have you noticed all four of the greatest poets in this world are Muslim, and yet all the Muslims you meet are illiterate or covered head to toe in black burqas or looking for buildings to blow up. If you are figuring these people out, send me an email," end of quote. This is Adiga writing to the Chinese premier. I hope to have made a case for Re-Orientalism via Hindu Orientalism in Adiga's novel. It is my contention that the redressal of the backwardness of Muslims that both the White Tiger and the Sachar Report described failed because Re-Orientalism triumphed over demonstrated marginality of Muslims. And this is evident from responses to Sachar Report from the BJP and the RSS. But Sachar Report, in my view, should be analyzed along with the 2007 Ranganath Mishra Commission report. And Mishra report proposed reservation for jobs along the lines already available to the OBC. No less significant was the 2011 Prevention of Communal and Targeted Violence Bill. The backdrop of the bill was, of course, not simply the 2002 anti-Muslim Gujarat pogrom, but also a series of other riots, both before and after, in which Muslims suffered the most. So as if it had anticipated Re-Orientalism, the Sachar Report painstakingly argued how taking policy steps to overcome the backwardness of Muslims was an affirmation of the universal constitutional obligation, not promotion of sectional interest. The measure it suggested comprised both the general and what it called community specific. To this end, the Sachar Report proposed forming of an equal opportunity commission. Sachar himself cited a ruling of the Supreme Court, and I cite, "We conceive the duty of this court to uphold the fundamental rights and thereby honor the sacred obligation to the minority communities who are our own," unquote. However, Re-Orientalism defeated the Sachar Report, and I will show how. L.K. Advani, key leader of the BJP, projected as the future Prime Minister at that time, was hostile to the very idea of forming such a committee. To Advani, formation of such a report was appeasement of minorities, a political crime. When its findings went public, he dismissed them as the worst kind of vote bank politics. To other leaders and organizational wing of Hindutva, the Sachar Report was, quote-unquote, anti-national. They accused actually Rajinder Sachar of, and I quote, caring for terrorists, end of quote. So Sachar himself was described as caring for terrorists. Rakesh Sinha, who is a professor of political science at the University of Delhi, as well as the director of India Policy Foundation, and is regarded as the most the most authentic RSS ideologue. And Sinha described the report, such a report, as an example of minoritism and, as he called it, a fraud on the nation. Sinha's opposition actually compressed the whole of modern Indian history in relation to Muslims and the attendant Orientalism, claiming to have read the report from cover to cover. But Sinha, and as he said, it will eventually lead to, and I quote, creation of a nation within a nation. And therefore he went on to call for deconstructing the psychology that Muslims are separate from others in this country. To enable this, Article 30 of our Constitution needs to be revoked. This will enable the integration of the Muslims into the national mainstream. It is the mindset of false identity politics that needs to be demolished. This is Rakesh Sinha a statement to recall Article 30 grants rights to all minorities, whether based on religion or language, to establish and administer educational institutions of their choice. Re-Orientalist premises and thoughts such as Sinha's come to their full glare in responses to Sachar from Organizer, the English mouthpiece of the RSS. And I focus on this weekly magazine. Now, just to give you a little bit about what this journal or weekly magazine is, it claims to be the custodian of unadulterated patriotism. Its readers include power elites of all hues, including members of parliament and business elites, and its readers are spread in which was titled Sachar Report and Terror Crescent. And you have to pay special attention to this term, terror crescent. It charged Sachar with supporting violence. In its reading, the Sachar Committee has at its mandate the same task last given to Lord Minto and Mr. Morley in 1909 of engineering division between Muslims and the rest. Notable is division between Muslims and the rest. This is, of course, a distortion to introduce representative politics. The British had proposed the Morley-Minto reforms, which provided for separate electorate not only for Muslims but also for Dalits, Sikhs, Christians and Anglo-Indians. Importantly, representing Dalits and supporting separate electorate, Ambedkar had fought a bitter battle against Gandhi, who opposed this. Now, this erasure by Organizer echoes similar erasure by Sinha, because the Organizer is trying to put it as Hindu versus Muslims, whereas in the original it is not just Hindu versus Muslims, there are many other communities. So its aim was to create a kind of politics of enmity, of religious antagonism. Rakesh, who I cited earlier, he described Sayyid Ahmad Khan as the actual father of the two-nation theory and separatism, and linked both to the Sachar Report. Sinha, of course, in doing so, erased the fact that the foundation of two-nation theory was laid, in my interpretation, as far back as 1760, 3 years after the Battle of Plassey, when the British soldier writer William Watts gave the first idea that Hindus and Muslims are two separate nations and described Muslims as virulent, violent, and Hindus as timid and meek. Savarkar and other people, they build on the foundations, the intellectual foundation laid by Orientalists like William Watts. Anyway, back to Rakesh Sinha. What he did was to erase a lot of these facts from history and present it as simply Hindu versus Muslims, and of course accusing the latter, meaning Muslims, of dividing the country, linking it to separatism, and so on and so forth. Of course, in the process, he forgot to mention that it was actually Sayyid Ahmad Khan who had also described Hindus and Muslims as two eyes of a beautiful bride called India. And this is a statement Sachar himself quoted in his preface to a book which was published in 2014 or 15 from Melbourne University Press. He was invited to give a talk. Because of his old age he could not, but he did send his preface to the organizer. Now, the interesting thing in the organizer coverage of Sachar is that it linked Sachar report to terrorism. And I will give a quote according to the organizer. Quote, "No longer can it be said that Indian citizens are free from Al-Qaeda virus. Modules and cells of this entity now exist across the country, including in several campuses and even among certain policymakers and business houses. Unlike in the 90s, terrorists are now assured of a local support structure in most part of the country, including in UP, Bihar, Rajasthan, Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, West Bengal, and Kerala. End of quote. After the Mr. report, organizer termed the 6-year rules of the UPA as the period of what it called Hindu subjugation. The discussion and framing of the issue by organizer clearly demonstrated how, through Hindu Orientalism, the issue of Muslims' marginalization was actually turned upside down, and eventually made into an issue of subjugation of Hindus. Such responses were not simply verbal statement, they were also reflected in policy practices. In response to the Sachar report, the central government launched a pre-matriculation scholarship scheme for students based on academic and economic criteria. Those who had scored 50% marks in the annual examination and the annual income of their parents were below rupees 1 lakh qualified for such a scholarship. Based on these criteria in Gujarat, 55,000 students qualified for this scholarship. However, as Chief Minister of the state, Modi refused to give a scholarship on the ground that the scheme discriminated against poor students of other communities. After becoming Prime Minister, Modi dismissed any such move for reservation or positive discrimination because, in his view, India's constitution did not favor religion-based reservation. But Modi's contention is flawed because his existing reservation is already religious. The constitution, scheduled caste order relating to Article 341 states, and I quote, "No person who professes a religion different from Hindus, the Sikhs, or the Buddhist religion shall be deemed to be a member of a scheduled caste." End of quote. Now, what I have shown is how the RSS employed Re-Orientalism to subvert the issue of backwardness and marginalization of Muslims. And assemblage of keywords from titles of 13 stories from the organizer would leave readers convinced that such a report had nothing positive and it was a result of a perverse mindset connected to Muslim fanaticism, terrorism, separatism, appeasement of disloyal minorities, and all leading to the subjugation of Hindus. So all these terms that I've given here, they're all taken from organizers' articles. So this is a classic example of subverting the entire aim of such a report. Let me clarify here that I don't suggest that the Congress party, which formed these committees and took policy steps to implement some of the recommendation of the Sachar, was entirely sincere. A committee established by the Congress to examine its defeat in 2014 election maintained that its so-called minority appeasement policy was one key factor for its defeat. And much before the 2014 election, the Congress itself withdrew the anti-communal violence bill. Though it created Ministry of Minority Affairs, its performance, as the Amitabh Kundu Committee noted in 2014, was far from satisfactory. The Sachar report, the media reported, excluded data in the only area where Muslims were overrepresented, that is in jails. And as the government's own data show from 1998 to 2014, along with other minorities, the ratio of Muslims exceeded their percentage in population. The marginalization of Muslims in political economy and their overrepresentation in jail thus throws a question about democracy. And it is not just about India, also about democracy like the US Australia, and Netherlands. And that question is, why minorities in democracies stand underrepresented in political economy and overrepresented in jails? Does democracy ensure immunity for some from being jailed even if their crimes are visible? In contrast, does democracy imprison many others even when there exists no evidence of their crime or nature of their crime is far less severe than those of the powerful? When they stalk, and I'm getting back to the white tiger, when they stalk the rich upper caste businessman in the novel bends down to welcome Vijay, son of a pig herds from Balram's own village, who later becomes a politician and businessman, the white tiger calls it marvels of democracy and something better than an erection. At the end of the novel, Balram expresses his joy at having become a rich businessman in Bangalore. Though the possibility that the police might catch him for having murdered Ashok, who was his boss, it still haunts him, he is confident of escape. And I quote, "I am now one of those who cannot be caught in India. At such moments, I look up at this chandelier and I just want to throw up my hands up and holler so loudly that my voice it carry over all the way to America. I have made it." End of quote. The shrillness of Balram's voice and the joy is matched only by the silence and grim face of Ram Prasad, who actually is Muhammad. As India rises, while Balram escapes prison, Muhammads in India perish in jails in proportion exceeding their percentage in population. The dumping of the Sachar Report by the current regime illustrates the victory of militarized, mediatized, ceremonial, statistical democracy over democracy as a sensibility or as an ethos. It is the victory of Balram joyously roaring under the glittering chandelier over green-faced Prasad, who continues to be marginalized and impoverished in the midst of India rising. And worse, in order for himself to become visible, Balram renders Prasad voiceless and jobless first and completes his invisibility by permanently expelling him from the rest of his life. Now, in 1.5 minutes, I will conclude. So what I have tried to do here, by focusing on responses to the Sachar Committee report from BJP and RSS, I have shown how Re-Orientalism in the vocabulary of Hindu Orientalism was a key factor that led to the stigmatization of relative backwardness among Muslims. Central to the deployment of Hindu Orientalism vis-a-vis the Sachar report were the tropes of Muslim fanaticism, terrorism, separatism, and minority appeasement. These tropes, I suggest, were carbon copied from the knowledge system of the British colonialism, namely Orientalism. I have used the character of Balram from the White Tiger as exemplifying militarized and mediatized Orientalized democracy on the one hand, and that of Ram Prasad, who is Muhammad, as illustrative of democratic sensibility as an ethos on the other. With the near dumping of the Sachar Committee report by the current regime, the victory of Balram seems almost total. However, this victory was not inevitable. Had Balram examined his own Re-Orientalism and instead identified with the suffering and pain of Prasad, who is Muhammad, probably a new path to confront the tyranny of the stork and money-marred, criminal, corrupt, ceremonial democracy would have opened. I initially found Lisa Lau's idea of Re-Orientalism useful for its concern with perpetration of Orientalism in the contemporary South Asian English literature. I agree with her argument that this perpetration is continued not by the so-called Occidentals, but by Oriental themselves. Rest of her argument, in my view, is poorly conceived. Lau concludes as follows, quote, "It is somehow mildly ironic that when the opportunity arose to move away from Orientalism, the direction some diasporic authors have chosen to move in is Re-Orientalism," unquote. In my view, she found it ironic only because she did not think adequately about the mutual imbrication of Orientalism and nationalism. By the phrase, "when the opportunity arose," she means the formal end of colonialism and takeover of power by the natives, or the so-called natives. Since she is concerned with change of hand from colonial to the post-colonial, rather than substance or mechanics of power and mutual bind among local, regional, and international elite, she comes to such a conclusion. In my view, there is nothing ironic about it. Carol Breckenridge and Van der Veer in 1993 argued this, and I quote, "Nationalism is thus not the answer to Orientalism as implied in Edward Said's book. Rather, nationalism is the avatar of Orientalism in the latter colonial and post-colonial periods," unquote. Lisa Lau's argument is premised on a wrong and neat distinction between what she calls home and diaspora writers. If we closely analyze the trajectory of Neeraj C. Chaudhary, the distinction between home and diaspora becomes fairly facile. Chaudhary's Orientalism, especially in relation to Islam, began in India and continued to flourish in Oxford, where he later moved and he died. Lau takes home and diaspora as two disjointed spaces and then proceeds to examine if and how Orientalism works in those spaces. My submission here is that Orientalism itself is a home beyond the geography of East and West in its own right, and it possesses the mandate to employ writers, journalists, and academics and others from all over the world. That Neeraj C. Chaudhary and V.S. Naipaul are dead doesn't mean the end of Re-Orientalism. We have Fareed Zakaria, Arnab Goswami, and many others among us. The analysis of response from the RSS BJP to Sachar Report also demonstrates continuity from colonial Orientalist discourse of William Watts in the 18th century to that of organizer in the present. There is a thread of continuity about Muslims as violent and Islam as intolerant from William Watts through W. Hunter to organizer RSS and yes, to the White Tiger. It is clear that Re-Orientalism is a far more comprehensive practice to be limited to just text and novels. If Edward Said, who is known for his work on Orientalism, if Edward Said narrowly viewed Orientalism in terms of text as power, Lisa Lau viewed Re-Orientalism in a similar fashion. While Halak's proposal to see and think about Orientalism as a larger systemic structure, as a form of modern power, I suggest, should be extended to Re-Orientalism, including its manifestation in the vocabulary of democracy and dumping of the Sachar Report under the dark reign of Mr. Narendra Modi in the contemporary times. So that is where I will stop. Thank you for your attention.